For those joining us, we'll get started in about a minute. We're just waiting for everyone to be able to get into the webinar. All right, so I think we'll get started, and if we have people coming in late, that's no big deal at all. So welcome everyone to our GRADflix training session. As a heads up, we did host an information session last week that kind of was an overview about the competition, what GRADflix is, what's involved, how you submit a video, eligibility, things like that. If you were there, awesome. If you weren't able to make it to the session or you want to review that information, the session was recorded and is posted right now on our GRADflix resource website. And similar with this one will be recorded and posted there as well in case you want to go back and look at the information again. So to start things off with the territorial acknowledgement, the University of Waterloo acknowledges that much of our work takes place on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our main campus is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. Our active work towards reconciliation takes place across our campuses through research, learning, teaching, and community building, and is centralized within our Office of Indigenous Relations. And I want to mention the Office of Indigenous Relations has fantastic workshops, events, information. So I highly recommend going and checking out all of the resources available there. And I also want to mention that things like territorial acknowledgements are only one step towards reconciliation, and there's still lots of things that can be done and are being done. So in terms of agenda of what we're going to be covering today at our training session, so you have an overview of what's going to happen. First, I am Ashley Ryan. I am a graduate and postdoctoral programming specialist over at Graduate Studies and Postdoctoral Affairs, and I'm going to be talking about, tips and tricks for creating your 60-second video, some resources and software that could help you along in that process. We also have Elizabeth here from the Reading Communication Center to talk to you about communicating your research in that 60-second short video. And we have Lauren here, who's going to be talking about copyright considerations as well. And then at the end of the event, you'll have the opportunity to ask any questions that you have that pop up in our live Q&A section at the end. So some housekeeping notes in related to the question period. Our chat function has been disabled, but if you would like to ask those questions, you can actually use the Q&A function that should pop up either at the top or bottom of your screen. And you can submit your questions in there. You should also be able to submit them anonymously if that's something that you would like to use. And then at the end, we'll be able to pull the questions from there and answer them. And of course, if there's something that comes up after a question or a question you don't wish to share today, always free to reach out to us at gradventure@uwaterloo.ca, and we can get those answers for you as well. And just as a heads up again, that the session is being recorded. So tools and tips for creating your 60-second video. So you're here, you're probably interested to some extent in GRADflix and making that 60-second video. And you might be wondering, Ashley, I haven't maybe made videos in the past. How can I go about even doing this? So first, I want to mention there are tons of different styles of video that you can make for your GRADflix submission. One thing that is cool to go check out is that tons of previous submissions from GRADflix over the last 5 years have been posted on the Graduate Studies and Postdoctoral Affairs YouTube page. So that is a great place to go check out all these videos, get a kind of a sense of what kind of style of video you maybe want to use for yourself, what you like, what you dislike, how you want to maybe communicate to what your research is about. So there's tons of options to go and give you some inspiration. So here are some different types of videos you may want to consider using. One option is doing a live action video. So that's a video that depicts a real person or a real environment, typically with a person talking or with a voiceover. So live action video is a fairly quick and simple option for video that is focused and relatable. It's by far, I would say, the least time-consuming method and one that requires the least technical expertise. So many of us, having on Instagram and things like that, we've taken live videos before, and you don't need to have any sort of specialized equipment. If you have that smartphone with that video capability, that is totally okay to just film it right on your iPhone or Android or whatever you have. So when we're doing live action, it is a great method for getting your face and your voice and your personality out there for your audience to see. So some strengths, what I've kind of touched on already, but to recap, it's fairly easy and fast to do. It focuses the attention on the content. It's pretty good with limiting distractions, and it's good for building rapport with the audience, especially if you as the researcher are right in the video. Now, some weaknesses or some things to consider about doing a live action video is that it's not always effective at conveying complex ideas. So sometimes if you do have that research that is fairly complex and there's a lot of components to it, maybe you do want to have that kind of visual animation effect that we're going to talk about in a second. Another option to consider is screencasting. So a screencast is a video that depicts a person's computer screen with voiceover. So I have personally never used this method, but I've been told that it's a fairly easy one to kind of pick up and kind of navigate. Basically, you can have a video or a game or a program operating right on your computer, and you can kind of record your screen similar to how you might share your screen in like an online webinar, like I'm doing right now. So something like PowerPoint allows you to do this very easily, giving you the option to include audio and a cursor or not, depending on what you kind of want to do. So some strengths to this kind of option is that it's easy to set up. You can film from the comfort of your very own computer desk or wherever you have your computer. Screencasting allows you to illustrate ideas as you are discussing them. It also works pretty well with dynamic, ongoing visual action like a video game or a program tutorial. Now, some weaknesses or things to consider with screencasting is it can sometimes be distracting. So there can be a lot of visual information that's going on when you're screencasting. And so sometimes it's very easy for audience members to get distracted or overwhelmed trying to pay attention to your voiceover at the same time as they're trying to read or watch what's going on your screen. Moving on to animation, there's different styles of animation, but in general, it's a video that depicts animated like cartoon figures explaining or doing something, usually with a voiceover. So this one is a fun medium that allows for a lot of creativity in your design. Some strengths to general animation is that it's very flexible and with creativity. Through animation, you can depict elaborate concepts or even scenarios that would be difficult to capture through the other types that we've looked at already. And it can be highly engaging on a visual level for your learners as well. Some weaknesses or things to consider is that it can be fairly time-consuming. You need to make sure you have a script settled before you start animating because revisions can take a lot of work, especially with this kind of format of video. Because if you aren't sure what you want to do with your video or what you want to say, but then you start animating, having to go back and redo some of those pieces might be a bit more challenging compared to some live action, for example, depending on the situation. So if you're going to be doing animation or some of these other ones that are similar, you really want to have that script settled and know exactly what you want to say and when, and what you want to have come on your screen, and then go into that animation. So, it cuts back on the time of having to go back and redo those pieces. Animation can be also potentially distracting. So both for the audience, for the reasons similar to what we talked about with screencasting, and for the creator. And it's sometimes very easy to get caught up in perfecting the animation without asking yourself what it really adds to your video. So just make sure whatever you're animating in your video is really serving a strong purpose for what the message that you're trying to get across. Now moving over to stop motion, I personally really like stop motion. I think it's a very fun option. It's basically a video in which one frame is captured at a time with objects moving slightly in between each shot. So some strengths to stop motion, it conveys changing states or information very effectively. It's visually very distinct and engaging. It has similar strengths to both screencasts and animation. Some weaknesses are things to keep in mind. It is very labor and time intensive, I would say, but still could technically be done in quite a short period of time, especially with the 1 minute kind of cap on the video. But having to do that frame by frame setup will take a decent amount of time. And it might require some drawing skill depending on what you want to have show up in your stop motion. And it's kind of limited in how dynamic the visuals can be. And lastly, mixed media is a combination of a variety of media types. So like I mentioned, you don't have to necessarily do one of these ones that we were just talking about. You could do a mixture of all of them or a few of them and kind of, switch it up depending on what you want to do. You can have some live action, you can have some animation, some still images, audio, screencasting. It's really what works best for you and what you're comfortable with doing and what you think will really do well to get that message across for your research. So we're going to look at a few examples before we move on to some additional information. So the first one I want to show you is a live action video submitted last year by Caitlin Laidlaw. And she had a video that was titled Local Attitudes Towards Snow Leopards in Western Nepal. So we're going to check that out.
It's easy to say that we should conserve snow leopards when we're sitting at home comfortably in Canada. But how do people feel who live every day with snow leopards in their own backyard? I spent 5 weeks trekking in a remote protected area in western Nepal to answer this question. At the start, I had no idea what an adventure I was about to embark on. Pass 5 of 5. Conflict manifests physically in the form of livestock depredation, where a single snow leopard trapped in a night corral can kill nearly 100 livestock in a single night. Working with communities to understand their attitudes and what drives these attitudes could result in mitigation techniques targeted to the most influential drivers, offering a pathway to coexistence for both the communities and the snow leopard.
All right, so that's one great example. And now we're going to look at another one in 1 second.
Vehicle.
Oh, sorry, I forgot the situation here. All right, so this next one that we're going to look at is a stop motion animation submitted by Anna Good from the history department last year. And the title of her video is Forgotten Voices of the World Wars, examining attempted soldier suicides through Canadian Army court-martial documents.
Due to the recent digitization of Canadian Army court-martial documents, I was able to find unique case files that have not yet been considered. My master's research paper looks at 4 of these cases on Canadian soldiers who attempted suicide in the World Wars. My research is best illustrated by first understanding preceding works in the field. Historians such as Teresa Iacobelli have used Canadian Army court-martial documents to survey men accused of desertion, and she considers why only some were executed for their actions. William Pratt, on the other hand, has looked at soldier suicide and relies on military service files, suicide notes, and last letters as the basis for his research. My research aims to bring these 2 perspectives together by utilizing court-martial records to examine soldiers who are accused of attempted suicide. The use of legal records allows suicide to be studied from the perspective of those who survived. My hope is that this research will help give back the agency that has been unintentionally stripped from soldiers.
Now we have one more to look at here.
To meet the food demand of a growing world population,
All right, so, and this last one we're going to watch is a kind of different style of animation by Ms. Warsiad, and the title is Ammonia for Renewable Energy Storage, and this was submitted to our 2023 competition as well.
Most of the energy that we use today comes from fossil fuels, and these fossil fuels produce carbon dioxide, which is extremely bad for the environment. Solar power, which is the energy produced from the sun, with the help of solar panels, is much safer for the environment. However, the sun isn't always shining, so how do we get energy during the night? Well, we can store the excess energy produced during the day in a battery and use it at night. But there is a problem. A battery discharges when you're not using it, like how your smartphone battery percentage slowly decreases even if you don't use it. So, we cannot store energy in batteries for long periods of time. In my research, I will study an alternative system to chemically store solar energy for extended periods of time without any degradation in the energy quantity or quality.
The negative effects of my
All right, so after looking at those examples, like I mentioned, there's tons on the GSPA YouTube page if you want to go check out some others. But one thing you might be wondering, and people sometimes ask me, Ashley, do I need to be an expert in video creation to participate in GRADflix? And the answer is absolutely not. If anything, like, this is a fantastic opportunity to learn a new skill if you've never made a video. And it's super fun to participate. And I would say a large chunk of people who participate have never made a video like this before. So if you're in that kind of situation, you wouldn't be alone. There are tons of different, learning opportunities on LinkedIn Learning or YouTube tutorials if that's something that you want to check into, if you want to do like a specific style of animation, for example. But you do not have to be an expert to participate. So take a second to think about maybe like the skills and the tools that you already, are using in your daily life, potentially. Like I mentioned earlier, do you have a smartphone? If so, you've probably already taken videos and photos and audio recordings, and kind of it's taking that next step of putting them together potentially and using software or even software right on your phone to kind of take clips and put them together and put audio on top. But you're kind of, if you're in that situation, you kind of already have that experience with taking videos and you might not even think about it. And the reality is a lot of smartphones can record great quality videos. So you don't have to go and rent out fancy equipment or anything to do these kinds of videos for GRADflix. You can record right on your smartphone. Similar with PowerPoint. PowerPoint presentations can be set up with animations and timing, and you could add music, and you could fade and increase or decrease volume, and you can export it as the MP4 file as well. So even though many of us use PowerPoint presentations as already for classes, or if you're teaching or anything in that kind of nature, if you're going to a conference, there are tons of additional PowerPoint capabilities that you might not even know that you have access to that can make your GRADflix video. Similar to if you like to draw or sketch or create graphics on things like Canva, you could totally use those things to add into your video. So here are some kind of resources and options to think about when editing a live action video. So, it's a good idea to, use different video clips and audio clips and photos. You can kind of alter video clips depending on what you want to do by quieting or muting sound. You can speed some things up. You can slow some things down. You can splice them together. You can add text over your photos and videos. And you can even add filters if you'd like. So right on the right-hand side, we have some options that you could look into, and there are tons of other kind of free software and apps as well to use. So things like, for example, on iPhone, you have iMovie or Splice. Those are free options to create a video. Android has things like Power Director and KineMaster. On desktop, there is OpenShot, Shotcut, DaVinci Resolve. There are a lot of kind of free options, and even the ones that kind of require that payment have the option of a free trial or a free version, potentially with some watermarking involved. So screencasting, if that's something of interest to you, an option might be looking into Screencast-O-Matic. So they have free to paid versions on Mac and Windows. So it allows you to capture any part of your screen. If you want to, you can actually add like a webcam portion in the frame, so you can have both going at the same time. It allows you to, hook up a microphone and record your screen while you're including audio at the same time. You can also turn the start and end of your screen depending on what you want to do. PowerPoint is also a great option for screencasting, where you can record a selected area of your screen. You can add audio from your selected microphone if you wish. You can play around with your cursor on the screen, or you don't have to, but there are tons of options. Animation, if that's something you're interested in, some options are Animaker, Powtoon, Beyond. You can try them out. If you aren't sure what you want to go with, you can always go play around with them and see if it's something you want to use for GRADflix. And if it ends up being something you don't like the look of, you can always check out a different option as well. So stop motion animation, if you want to use kind of an online or an app-based support, you can use Animoto or Cloud Stop Motion. When I've made stop motion animation videos in the past, just personally, I've honestly just taken my camera or my cell phone and I've just taken tons and tons of photos of little tiny changes in each frame. And then I put them together into like a slideshow and just made the slide transition so fast. So it basically just becomes a massively quick slideshow, if that makes sense. So there are definitely different options for stop motion, just like animation and screencasting and live action. So putting it all together. So for that example, like I mentioned with PowerPoint, it allows you to include text and images, multiple video files, multiple audio files, movement, transitions. A lot of really simple editing can take place right in PowerPoint. And so an example of that PowerPoint kind of video, like I'm going to mention, the GRADflix teaser that's actually on the GSPA website and our YouTube channel was made using PowerPoint. So we're going to give it a quick look right now to show you what I mean of what PowerPoint is capable of doing, if that's of interest to you. So some of you might be thinking like me, when I originally saw this teaser, I was like, oh, I do not even think that this was made in PowerPoint. So PowerPoint has quite a few capabilities that I didn't even know were possible. Again, you can use different auto timing in there. You can add music. If you want to, there are actually options for getting free versions of music and photos like bensound.com, where you can kind of add the attribution or pay for a license to remove the attribution. But there are ways to do it with copyright friendly ways. And Lauren will kind of talk about the copyright logistics in general as well. All right, so tips, tricks, and best practices before I hand things off, taking your video to the next level. So just some things to keep in mind as you're getting started with that GRADflix video. You're thinking about things like, what is the best or most feasible type of video for your content? Like we mentioned earlier, sometimes with more complex topics, maybe you want to have that more visual component. And so perhaps maybe in that example, live action maybe is not the best suited for your research. Or maybe in other scenarios, live action is the best way to go. So it totally depends on your situation and your research. Another thing to keep in mind is planning. Remember when I mentioned that creating a script and a storyboard before you start filming is going to save you time in the long run, so you don't have to go back as much and change things. Using images to illustrate or reinforce what you're saying. You know, audio and visuals should complement each other in this case, and we also want to make sure that we're not just adding random photos and random audio. We want to make sure that you're really using things strategically to get your message across. It's also great to sound authentic rather than perfect. You know, nobody's perfect. You don't have to take a million different shots or animation changes. You know, authentic will go a long way. With that said, you know, it is a good idea to take a few extra shots, especially if you're doing like live action, so that you have some different ones to choose from when you get to the editing stage. And tied to that, you don't have to force yourself to, you know, film 60 seconds perfectly in one go. You could take multiple smaller components and kind of edit them together. And that kind of saves you from having to memorize a bunch of stuff perfectly and having to do a bunch of reruns. So important filming considerations, you know, just be thinking about things like audio quality and stability. So, you know, thinking about maybe you want to use a photography like tripod or putting your camera on a table, for example. Thinking about the lighting, you know, wanting to have some, you know, bright enough light so it's not a grainy photo. Or if looking back at the audio, making sure there's not cars driving by, unless of course it's relevant in your research. But just things to keep in mind as you're going to be making your video. Tips for editing. There are options for removing white noise or different kind of sounds in your background if it becomes a problem. There are different options for adjusting audio level. And also, if you're going to be exporting to that MP4 file, just to remember to choose as highest quality as possible. So something like 720p compared to the very lower ones. So lastly, additional tools and resources for helping you get started. Things like free online tutorials through LinkedIn Learning or YouTube. Remember, you can utilize your free Office 365 accounts with PowerPoint. You can use other tools to create graphics, like things like Canva or Adobe Spark. You can make use of open license content like Pixabay Video, Bensound, Unsplash. And Lauren also has a tip sheet that's linked into these slides, which I'll send you after as well for open license content. And like I mentioned before, there are tons of GRADflix examples on our YouTube page if you want to go get some inspiration for your own. And things to think about as you're going through your videos, things like, did anything distract you while you were watching it? Was there anything that was particularly effective in the video that you would like to use in your own? Could you hear the audio and could you read the text easily? So you can be thinking about these things when you're making your own submission. So I'm going to be now handing things over to Elizabeth, who is from the Reading Communication Center, to talk to you about communicating your research in a 1-minute video.
Thanks, Ashley. I'll just get my screen set up here. Oops, sorry. Take a moment. Ashley, I'm seeming to have some problems. I apologize.
No problem.
With the link that I sent you, could you pull up my presentation, please?
Sure. I ended up copying and pasting all of your slides into the PowerPoint deck. Is it okay if I just share the slides again?
Yes, because
Okay.
they should. Yep. And I'll open mine up here so I can see what's going on, and I'll just let you know when I'm ready to go to the next slide.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. All right. If you just let me know, Ashley, when the slides are up and ready to go.
They are up to my knowledge. Hopefully everyone can see them.
Okay. All right, so welcome. My name is Elizabeth Van Stam, and I am the Multimodal and Public Scholarship Developer at the Writing and Communication Center. And today I'm going to quickly go over some foundational concepts to help you make decisions when planning, drafting, and revising your GRADflix video. Next slide, please, Ashley. I want to emphasize that my presentation today is really just a brief overview, and you will likely have questions that you want to follow up on as you start to apply some of these concepts and when developing your video. So if you need or want further support, you can ask questions in the upcoming drop-in sessions on November 15th and December 4th. You can check out some of the Writing and Communication Center resources like our Design and Deliver asynchronous workshops on Learn. You can make a one-to-one appointment, virtual or in person, at the Writing Center. And I will be here at the end of this presentation for a Q&A session, as will Lauren and Ashley for their portions of the presentation. All right. So today in my presentation, I'm going to talk about how understanding and remembering your audience can help you make decisions about the focus and structure of your video. Then I'll share various storytelling options that can help you keep your video focused and engaging. And finally, I'll touch on some important elements of multimodal communication, which is communication that uses more than one mode at a time, like video, which has spoken, audio, and so on. All right, next slide, please. So clarifying your audience and your purpose for your video is one of the most important steps for you to create an engaging and focused video or presentation. Next slide, please. Although you already know some important facts about your audience, it's still worth reflecting on how your specific GRADflix audience relates to your work. You know that your audience is other scholars, so people embedded in the academic experience and therefore fairly smart folks. However, they aren't specialists within your field. And although you can assume they know some of the basics of your research process, you can't assume that they already understand the important concepts from your field. So it's really helpful to spend a few minutes thinking about how these smart but non-specialist scholars might relate or not to your research. We want you to think about what they might already be familiar with and what you might need to explain. Additionally, you want to think about what references or metaphors they may already be familiar with, what elements of your research you can use to create a foundation of knowledge for them. You will also want to think about the parts of your research which might be difficult for them to grasp, believe, or really even value. So it's important to reflect on the audience and ask yourself questions about who they are, what do they care, what do they know. And this reflection shouldn't be something that you just do within your mind as you're thinking and planning, but actually write this down. The act of writing your ideas and brainstorming requires analysis and evaluation and synthesis of these ideas that allows you to provide context and organize your thoughts. So you could move from just having one basic idea, and as you write them down, as you do your brainstorming about audience, you can get new perspectives and ideas that emerge as you are planning in the written or visual format. This brainstorming and writing it down, brainstorming audience and writing it down, can also help you make decisions about what to include in your video or what not when it comes to finally drafting your storyboards. Some prompts for audience reflection: thinking about things that they know. What is absolutely necessary for you to explain for them to understand your research, and what's just extra? And what do they care about? And what are the topics or ideas that they might likely be resistant to? Next, please. In addition to understanding your audience in more detail, it's also beneficial to identify the specific goal of your presentation. Although all GRADflix videos share a general goal to communicate your research project in an engaging manner, you might want to do that by engaging curiosity or empathy, or getting your audience excited about a kind of technology, or amazing your audience with an idea that they hadn't understood properly until now. So you can frame this purpose or your goal, thinking about it in ways of things like, I want to convince people that this is a problem that needs to be solved today. I want people to know how much fun my research can be, and I want people to feel what my research participants felt. Once you have a sense of your goal or the purpose for your video, write it down, put it on a sticky note that you can see as you work on your video. So it's something that's a touchstone that you can refer to regularly. If you're working on it, you get stuck, or you're wondering if an idea is relevant and should be included within your video, you can always look at that sticky note and remind yourself, what am I trying to do with my video? All right, next, please. It's going to be difficult to pare your thesis down to a 1-minute video, because a minute of video isn't even the same as a minute of straight speech. This means that you're going to have to condense, exclude, or move quickly through ideas that take up pages or possibly even chapters of your thesis. With only a minute to work with, you really need to condense your work down to its core messages. But how do you take that massive, complex project that you're working on and talk about it in only 1 minute? What you do is you find the seed or the kernel, that main idea, and you brainstorm and you think about one key message that you need to deliver based on this kernel. One way to figure out what that kernel is, what that core message is for your research, is to use the Booth's craft of research questions. This is a method of identifying or crafting your research questions before you start a research project, but also, I guess, before you start a GRADflix video. It helps you wonder and think about what you've already been working on, why it might be interesting to other people, and what key ideas or messages could come out of it. So your questions, your Booth's craft of research 3 questions are: I am working on or studying because I want to find out, and to help my readers understand. Hopefully, as you move through these things, when you get to help my readers understand, there's your core message or the kernel that your video should be developed from. Keep your audience and presentation and goal in mind when answering these questions, because your answer to these questions, even when speaking about the exact same research, can and will change when your audience and presentation goals change. Next, please. Just because, and it is very important to remember, just because we're asking you to communicate simply and clearly doesn't mean we're asking you to trivialize your work. What we're asking you to do is really focus on the most important idea that will help an audience of other scholars get why your research matters. And this is really an important skill for you to think about and to practice, not just for GRADflix, but being able to communicate complex work clearly without confusing jargon is a skill that you will be using throughout your academic career, including scholarship applications, sharing with industry partners or anyone outside of academics, or even sharing or communicating your research within interdisciplinary research groups. So how do you know that you are creating a clear and engaging video? You choose a storytelling structure that allows your audience to understand and care about the research you are sharing in your video. Next, please. So this leads us to the next section of the presentation, telling the story. Story is vitally important because how you decide to share your research strongly influences audience engagement and interest. And there are really many different ways to tell a story. There's no single good one. The trick, though, is figuring out the way that works best for you and the purpose of your video and your audience. So to help you think about what your storytelling structure should be, here are a couple options that you can consider. All right. One way to communicate the core kernel of your research or that main message is to use the elevator pitch structure. We call it an elevator pitch structure because it's meant to be something you could do or convey to someone while in an actual elevator between floors. You don't have 5 minutes to set up the background and have all of your justifications lined up in front of them. You have 30 seconds until your audience gets off the elevator. An elevator pitch should include a hook. So you need to get your audience's attention fast. A hook could be something like a problem or an assumption, a fact or a statistic that's really interesting and intriguing, or just asking your audience to imagine something that is relevant or interesting or emotional. The elevator pitch should also include your solution. So what's your take? What are you going to do to respond to or address what you've set up in the first part? If it's a problem or a fact, how are you going to reply to that? How does your research connect with it? Finally, an elevator pitch should include significance. So why does this matter, right? Why does this solution or your take, which is your research, why does it matter? What change will happen because of what we know from this new information as you solve the problem via your research? The next option for structure is the narrative structure, which can help you tell a story about your work. In a narrative structure, they have story points that revolve around a main character, person, place, event, or idea. And normally they are experiencing some sort of challenge and there's going to be a resulting change. So the narrative structure is something that we're probably all very familiar with. You know, something like that is once upon a time, the character lived in a world. Then something happened that meant that something has to change. The character faces this change and survives or doesn't. And then they return to the world that is changed as a result of the journey that they have come through. The narrative structure has basic 3 parts: a beginning, which sets up the scenario, the middle of the drama, you are the intervention, your work is complicating matters, and then the end, which is the result or the resolution, what all of this means. This isn't the only way to tell a story. Some stories reverse the narrative order and start out with that resolution or the ending and tell things backwards or out of order. But you only have a minute, so play around, experiment, but keep it simple. Not all stories have a satisfying ending. If your research hasn't finished or there's no clear bang to the end of it, sometimes, I don't know about you, but for my graduate work, I always thought I have these 4 questions and I'm going to get 4 answers. And I have these, but what really happened was I have these 4 questions, I have 4 kind of answers, and now I have 10 more questions. So considering what your research looks like to you, where you are in the process, and what you have found, consider alternate revisions or changes to the narrative. So instead of having that clear end, you could set the scene and create a twist. One of my favorite and most well-received conference presentations, which is not GRADflix, had a twist, right? I went to a conference where I didn't have all of my data analyzed. I only had about, less than 1% of it done. And so I set up this presentation and then ended it with, 1% done, now 99% to go. And that really helped me shape what my discussion and my conversation is going to be at the end. You could also weave together different perspectives. Western narratives also, often highlight change and triumph. So something like in the beginning, there was a difference and then a victory and personal growth. However, not all storytelling traditions require the main character to improve over the course of the story. In other traditions, stories are about witnessing a moment in time, or feeling a strong emotion, or watching someone else make a different choice than one that we would have made ourselves. So you should pick the story structure that really feels right to you. Either it's the kind of story you like to listen to or tell, it aligns with your message, or it has a structure used by the people involved in your research, or it's just simply fun and a unique, fun way to present your research. Next, please. I hope we're in line, Ashley. I'm on the cars model now. Because
Hold on 1 second. I'm just gonna. I think I may have.
slide 12
What does the slide look like?
has circles in it. So a big red circle and then inside a green circle.
Communicate through your work by creating a research space. Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I apologize for the technical difficulties that resulted in the style of this presentation. I will make sure that my slides with the notes below are available so that you can anyone listening can clarify points and find any questions that you may have. All right. Back to our final option that I'll be discussing in this presentation, but not the final option overall. Because you are speaking with an academic audience, you may want to use the CARS model or creating a research space to structure your presentation. This structure is often a nice fit for, but is not limited to, research that uses the scientific method as an approach. The CARS structure employs 3 distinct moves that show your audience, your first move being the background or the so what of your research. This is what we know about my research and why we care about it. Your move 2, your niche. However, here's what we don't know or what is wrong. And finally, filling that niche. This is how my research is going to address or fix that problem. Next, please. No matter how you decide to share your research story, you don't have to tell the whole story. In fact, I would argue very strongly that you don't have the time in a 1-minute video to tell your whole story. So sometimes you just don't have the whole story, yet maybe the whole story isn't even really possible to tell. Or other times, telling your whole story means that you miss out on important details. So regardless of the structure, the storytelling structure you choose, the story of your research doesn't have to be the beginning, middle, and end of your actual dissertation or thesis. Instead, you can focus on a part of the story that you think is most important or representative of a larger concern or something that's just worth talking about. The biggest piece of advice I can give you when you start thinking about your structure is that the solution to creating a focused and engaging video is never going to be add more words but talk faster, right? And this is why I've spent so much time for specifically thinking about your audience, purpose, and storyline. You want to make sure you carefully consider all of these things to help create a clear and focused message that can occur all within 1 minute. Next slide, please. And although we have these structures to help you put your story together, there's no simple formula for telling it. It's up to you as a person who cares about this research to add in those extra flavors, right? We want to see your feelings, your passion, your excitement, and the connections. You can add your extra flavors by being aware of the various modes of communication used in a video and being intentional with your choices about your audio and visual design choices. And I'm going to briefly cover how you can do exactly this in the next section of my presentation. So next slide will be yellow one that says multimodal communication. Although I've just discussed structure as an isolated concept, I would encourage you to think about this structure. I would encourage you to think about your structure at the same time as you think about the design of the video. Because you are engaging in multimodal communication, you need to think about how the images, sounds, and movement you're using in your video will help shape your story at the same time. A video isn't just an image plus sound plus movement. It's all of these things added together to create something that's more than just each of its individual parts. We've been focusing on the words that you might use to tell your story. So who's your audience? Write it down. Brainstorm what the purpose is, write it down. But you really, in essence, are creating a video. And words and pictures should be working together to tell the complete story of your research. So how do you do this? Well, you draft these two pieces together. As you tell your story, consider what kind of visuals you might use to help translate your research for your audience, because a visual could clarify or provide extra details that you don't have time to share orally, or share the tone or emotion of your words. Next slide, please. Because it can be difficult to draft a video as a video, right? We recommend storyboarding as a way to plan and organize both the visual and audio elements of your video at the same time. To create a storyboard, use sticky notes or pieces of paper, or even a slide sorter in a slide app like PowerPoint or Canva to sketch out your scenes. We want your scenes to primarily focus on visuals and simple concepts. Not only do these sticky notes give you a sense of sequence or flow for your video content that you can move around very easily as you come up with new ideas or new ways of connecting or change the storytelling structure of your presentation. There's also much less cost to deleting, adding, or moving scenes around when you use a storyboard as your first draft versus a video. And when we think about storyboarding, what I want you to, where a good analogy would be to think about when you're writing and doing written communication, starting with an outline versus going straight into your writing where you have full sentences and paragraphs that are stuck together. You know, that outline is a lot easier to change. Storyboarding allows you to experiment with different structures, stories, ideas, and metaphors so that you can really find the right one without having to start from scratch each time you want to make a revision. While storyboarding, you should think about things like whether you want to do a voiceover or have a talking head, have an animated graph or a series of static images, use ambient music, a moving shot, and so on. There's lots of those different audio and video elements that we want you to consider along with your main messages and your structure as you're creating that storyboard. Some quick tips about communicating multimodally: use less text than you think you need. Remember back when we were speaking about, next slide, please. We're on a slide that has a heading of use text for snappy callouts. Remember when we were speaking about choosing structures, I said you need to choose structure and focus your content based on audience and purpose. Avoid the urge to speak faster. Well, the same principle holds true for your visuals. Remember your audience and purpose, and think about why the visual you are including helps communicate your focused message. Now create your visual with these things in mind and avoid that urge to add more text to explain or get more content in your video. Why? Because you'll never match every viewer's reading speed simultaneously. So it's important to keep your text to quick, short phrases that people can perceive quickly, like labels and short, snappy captions. If your instinct is to add text because you don't have time to say it out loud, this is a really big sign that you need to revise your script and outline. So go back to that storyboard and see if your message is clear and focused. Next slide, please. Not only do visuals need to be relevant to the story you're telling, but they also need to be easy to read and understand. Although your data and tables are surely very interesting to you and the people in your field, remember that time constraints. People don't have time to pore over a chart and understand every little detail of it and what it means. So keep your figures and tables, if they're in there, simple, and use colors or even animation to help your key messages stand out. Next, please. Use, create, and edit images and illustrations to help tell your story. Images can be very powerful when sharing your research story because they can show how things work or relationships between concepts, or provide a metaphor or an analogy to explain a complex task. The right image can help your audience understand your research, understand and care about your research. Just be really careful with your image use. What may be clear to you may not be clear to your audience. So how do you figure out if it is clear to everybody? Have someone have a look at it. Always incorporate feedback or peer feedback into your drafting process. Next slide. Often, an engaging video makes use of more than one image with your voiceover. So be creative and use your existing skills and interests to create your video. You could create stop motion from sculptures if you are someone who creates sculptures, embroider your data onto a sweater, paint your most surprising figure. So move from this very quantitative focused format of information into a more artistic representation. Write a song to teach the concept that you are communicating about. Have a child narrate your video, or add speech bubbles and transitions like a superhero comic. Really, there's so many different options here. You don't have to follow these exact ones, but the whole point of this slide is to tell you the sky's the limit here, and incorporate what you know and do best. And that doesn't have to be just about research in an academic field, in an academic environment. Next, please. Make sure that the images you use are representative of the ideas that you are sharing. So, for example, if you're talking about the importance of diversity in a field, then having images of only cis men or only white people may confuse your story. So you want to make sure that those images match what you're saying. When you're searching for diverse images, avoid Google Images. It's good practice is to provide attribution. So who created the image and the rules around if or how to reference the image. And so if you are providing attribution, quite often Google searches and the images you find don't have that information, whereas stock photo databases or images that you create yourselves will have this associated with it. Depending on the rules of the competition, you should either provide attributions in your video as a caption alongside the image, or at the end of the credits, or provide the attribution in your description. Next, please. Perform with your voice. Your pace, your tone, your volume, they all matter because they can let your passion and your interest for the subject shine through. Think about how your voice implies things about your message. So if you're sharing some somber information, you don't want to be doing it in a happy or playful tone, or vice versa, because this will undermine what you're saying. Next, please. As with any form of multimodal communication that incorporates audio and components, use sound or the lack of it to help get your message across. For example, ambient traffic noise may seem at odds with an artistic shot of geese in flight over a sunset. However, your message might be about urban sprawl and its effects on ecosystem, in which case that juxtaposition between the image and the sound is really useful and can be quite powerful or emotive. So when trying to make these decisions about what to do with your audio or visual components, return to your key message, audience, and purpose to help decide what sounds might be beneficial. All right, use GRADflix as an opportunity to take a risk and try something new, weird, or different. Just something that maybe you've always been curious about, but have never had the opportunity to try. Judges look at technical quality, but that's less important than effectively and persuasively telling the story of your research and getting your audience to care. And technical quality is more about making sure your content is clear, legible, listenable, and less about making it look shiny and fancy. And I guess this is just a note. Don't worry, right? Don't worry if you haven't done something like this before. All right. You can move to the last slide, Ashley. Okay, so we've covered a lot in a very short period of time. We can answer questions at the end of this session. And again, if there's anything else you want to follow up on, come see us at the Writing Communication Center for any stage, whether it's planning, drafting, or revising of your video. We can help. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, I'm going to hand things off to Lauren.
Hello, everybody. Just gonna take some time to share my screen here. Hopefully folks can let me know if things are showing up okay.
Yeah, we can see it.
That's great. Okay. So I'm Lauren Pyle. I'm the copyright and licensing librarian. You can usually find me in Dana Porter, that's Sugar Cube looking building on campus. The best way to reach me is to email copyright@uwaterloo.ca. And I'll say that's the main thing really that I hope that folks take away. Like there's lots of little nitty-gritty details, but copyright can be complicated, and it's definitely a great idea to ask questions if you're confused or if something needs clarifying. And copyright@uwaterloo.ca is the best way to ask questions of me and my team. So just to get us all on the same page, we'll talk about what copyright is. So copyright is the right to produce, reproduce, or publish a work or a substantial part of it. So we're really talking about that protection of intellectual property. So things that you think about up here, but then put on paper or in a document, or in this case, in a video. So for something to be protected by copyright, it has to be fixed. It can't just be an idea in your head. And so the rest of this presentation will focus on times when you don't need permission to use copyright protected content. And the reason we're doing this is because generally you're creating this video to communicate your research ideas. You're probably not going to have the time, energy, or money to ask permission from copyright holders, though I will say that is always an option. You can ask permission. But this set of slides will focus on when you don't need to ask permission based on exceptions in the Copyright Act or licensing schemas. So these are the 5 times that you don't need permission: when you're using a fact or idea, when you're using works that are in the public domain, when you're using Creative Commons or other openly licensed works. Some of that has been mentioned already today. When you're using a Copyright Act exception, you may have heard of things like fair dealing. That's one example of a Copyright Act exception. And when you're using your own content. So we've already talked a lot about the things that you'll create. As a student at the University of Waterloo, you own the copyright in the content that you create as a student, and in any research and teaching you do per Policy 73, Intellectual Property. So the first bit is facts and ideas. So on the fact side, it would make absolutely 0 sense for anybody to be able to own 2 + 2 = 4, for example. But what I always like to drive home with folks is that this also means that the facts of a situation aren't copyright protected, but the curation of them is. So often people do think about facts as that, math or very like chemical structures, those kinds of very straightforward things. But in my last example here, if someone was reporting on, say, a collision of a car, and they wanted to report that the driver was wearing a blue shirt, that's a fact of the accident. It might be a fact that that accident happened at King and Weber in Kitchener. And those 2 facts aren't copyright protected, but the article that a journalist would write about that collision would be copyright protected. So all of those facts mashed together, the selection and the curation of them is copyright protected. This also applies to data in terms of visualizations. So if you wanted to reuse data from a journal article and the author had put it together in a pie chart, you could take the underlying data and make it into a bar chart or some other kind of visualization and use it without asking permission. The data isn't protected, the curation and visualization of it would be. On the other side are ideas. So as I mentioned before, copyright doesn't protect things that are just sort of up in your head. It protects things that are fixed in some format. So, I mean, that seems pretty straightforward, but that also means that it doesn't protect theories, right? So somebody can have an idea or a theory and they can write it down, but their idea and expression of it don't have to be completely linked together. You can paraphrase, and just because you're paraphrasing someone's idea or theory doesn't mean that you need to ask copyright permission to do so. It wouldn't be efficient for one person to be able to claim a stake in that theory and the ability to talk about that theory for the rest of all time. Generally, I find that people have an easier time understanding of this when we talk about it in the fiction context. There's a term called scenes affaire, and what that really means is that you can't copyright a genre. So you think about a genre as an idea of a sort of setting of a novel, where you might have, two people who fall in love from, different families, and their families are arguing, and it's an awful time for everybody, a very Romeo and Juliet sort of a scenario. That idea that people can come from different backgrounds and dislike each other is not copyright protected in any way, shape, or form. The expression Romeo and Juliet would be copyright protected in its time. It no longer is because of the public domain, which we'll talk about in a moment. But that's the idea, is sort of this business that nobody owns one particular way of expressing something. It's the exact way of them writing it down and curating it that is what's copyright protected. So I just mentioned the public domain. Often the public domain is misunderstood. The public domain refers to things where copyright has expired. Sometimes folks tend to think that the public domain involves things that are just freely available. So they'll say, oh, it's public domain because it's on the internet. That's not true. Public domain is a very specific piece of the Copyright Act, and it involves when copyright expires in a work, which in Canada is a little bit complicated right now because it's just changed. But going forward, you can generally think of it as life of the author plus 70 years. So it has nothing to do with when the work is published, and everything to do with who created the work, when they died, and how much time has passed since they died. So in this particular example, Beatrix Potter, the author and illustrator of The Tale of Peter Rabbit, died in 1943. So more than 50 years, more than 70 years have passed since Potter's death. And so that work and the image that's on your screen right now aren't protected by copyright. That means I don't have to cite it. It means I can change it if I want. It means I could use these images to create an entirely new set of books. It means I could republish The Tale of Peter Rabbit and sell it in a store if I wanted to. The public domain means copyright is expired, so any protection associated with copyright is gone. So there is some complications with the change in term over the last few months. But if you have questions about whether or not something is in the public domain, I would recommend just reaching out to me. It can be a little bit complicated to figure out. But generally, as you might guess here, things that are in the public domain are generally older content. So if you're, doing work in archives, or if you're doing work about historical concepts, public domain might be really helpful to you. In a lot of cases, public domain isn't really very helpful in finding images and content for your video. The next section is about Creative Commons licensed works, or open licensed works in general. Most creators online for images, video, music will rely on the Creative Commons licensing schema to make their work more openly available. And really at its basis, what the Creative Commons licensing scheme is about authors communicating to users that they want their work to be reused. And here are the terms of how you can do that. So as you can see on the screen here, there are several different Creative Commons licenses, and they all use these same symbols to communicate how the license is restricted. For your video, you really want something that has a license that allows derivatives. So there are a few licenses here that have that ND equal sign symbol. And what that means is that content can't be adapted in any way. And many creators view that combination of music, image, song, other video content, and somebody else's content to be creating a derivative, creating that adaptation. So you want to be looking for a license that doesn't have the the ND. So any of these other licenses without the ND would be perfectly fine for your use in your video. So something like the Creative Commons BYNC, so Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial, for example, would be perfectly fine. Your video is not considered a commercial use, even though you're competing in a contest where you could, in theory, come away with a prize. So just to make that clear that that's not considered a commercial use. Again, if you run into Creative Commons licensed content and you're wondering if the license attached to it allows for use in your video or what it means in terms of what you need to do, feel free to reach out. Sometimes these things can be a little more complicated depending on how the creator has assigned the license, and we're happy to help. Really, the main thing to point out with Creative Commons licenses is that you do need to attribute. As you can see in all of them, except for the one on the far right, they have that BY symbol, which means you have to attribute. You have to provide credit to the person who created the original content. So generally what I would suggest for videos is having a final slide in your video that has your sort of references or attributions to different content in it. I know that, you know, having different attributions all the way throughout your video might not appear very aesthetically pleasing and might be distracting in terms of what you're trying to communicate. So having that slide at the end helps attribute the original creators while giving you that freedom to communicate your content without that those sort of distractions. But you do want to be very clear in your references that making it so that people understand what item came from where. So a list of references without some context won't be very helpful. So you want people to be able to find where you were sourcing your material at the end. That's the whole point of a reference, is for people to be able to find it and reuse it in the same way you did. So I did mention Copyright Act exceptions as one way to reuse content in your video. I will go over the non-commercial user-generated content exception here. I don't have a slide on fair dealing, and that's generally because we don't recommend the use of fair dealing for videos for content where it's going to be publicly available to anyone on the internet, which would be the case in terms of online distribution on YouTube channel. So it's not to say you can't use fair dealing, it's just to say that you would need to be more careful about it. And so that's why we recommend this exception instead. So the non-commercial user-generated content exception allows you to use works that are published or made available to the public. So as long as they're not secret, in a creation of your own, so in your video, as long as you are using the work for non-commercial purposes, as discussed before. This kind of video creation isn't a commercial purpose. You mention a source, so you're putting that attribution in the end of your video. You use a legal version of the work, so you're not sourcing it from a pirated source. So say you include a clip from a movie or something in your video, you're not downloading it illegally and using a clip that way. And your work doesn't have a substantial adverse effect on the original. So this last piece is the most contextual piece. And really what they're talking about mostly is reputational effect on the author and monetary effect on the author. So it might be more common to think about this if you're uploading a video onto YouTube that is a simple copy of a song, and the only thing you've changed is to add a picture of your cat that just sort of sits there and the song plays and people get to look at your cat. That's not really adding anything of your own, and it could have an adverse effect on the creator because you're just creating a simple copy, and people might go to your version instead of using the original. If you're using a tiny snippet of somebody else's work, or if you're adding your own content layered on top of it, for example, a description of your research, people won't go to your video to listen to that song, to see that image. They will go to the original to get that content, because they won't have to listen to a research presentation that isn't related to their search. So this is really about becoming a substitute, which is highly unlikely given the situation that you're in terms of the content that you're creating for this contest. So just mentioned here, it's often called the YouTube exception, because the whole point of having this in the Copyright Act was legislators acknowledging that we were in different times. This was 2012, mind you, and folks needed a way to be able to legally share and mash up new content to use it online, mainly in the ways that they were familiar with folks doing it on YouTube. And then one thing I always mention is that this exception hasn't been tested by the court, so there's no case law for us to rely on. All we have is the text in the act, which is pretty much, not exactly, but it's my interpretation is what you see on your screen. You can go and read section 29.21 in the Copyright Act. That's all the wording we have to go on, which means that there might be some people who don't agree and would want to sue based on that, but it's highly unlikely given that it is designed to support a model that is working very well in terms of what we think about with YouTube mashups and other adaptation-based creations online. And then last, as you go along, you're going to have questions in all of the different areas that have been gone over today. You might especially have copyright questions and think, am I doing this right? And so just remember what I said at the beginning. It can be complicated. It's not you. It's the Copyright Act. It's the situation. So if you're confused, just reach out. We get all kinds of questions at copyright@uwaterloo.ca, and I'm happy to answer any of them, even if it's just to go over content we've already gone over. And when you're developing content, think about what's reasonable and what's respectful. So there's often not a very clear-cut answer to copyright questions. Sometimes it's not, for sure yes or for sure no. It'll be somewhere in the middle and you're not sure. You have to think about the amount of risk that's involved and what you're willing to accept risk-wise. And often, that's just thinking I'm, making a research-based video that is very short for a competition among a small number of people that will be distributed in a very limited way. So the risk is probably relatively low. The risk might increase if you're using a significant amount of a Disney film or a significant copy of a Nintendo game, those kinds of things. Creators that we know to be litigious are more involved in tracking their content online. You also want to avoid finding tricky ways to go around copyright issues. So one of the examples that's come up lately is folks will say, oh, I found this image, song, something online, more likely images, and it was copyright protected. So I fed it through Stable Diffusion and asked it to make me an AI generated version of the same thing. And AI stuff isn't copyright protected, so I can do whatever I want with it, right? If you're looking for those kinds of loopholes, it's probably best to reach out for a second opinion and just try to focus on what you would think would be reasonable and respectful of an author. AI is a bit untested right now, and so that might not be the best example, but it is an example of a time where if you do ask the computer to come up with a new version of something, that we don't know if it's infringing copyright or not. So best to sort of steer clear of that kind of thing. And that includes other loopholes like downloading something from an illegal source and sort of making a reasoning that, well, you could have gone to the library to get it, so it's okay to use a pirated copy. So last and again, you can always ask us for help. So reach out if you have questions or any concerns about putting your video together that are related to copyright. Finally, just know that we can't provide legal advice. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't provide legal advice, and no one on the team is. We can provide information about the Copyright Act that will help you make a good decision. And that's it for me.
Thank you so much. Right. So I'm just going to switch over our screens again to jumpstart the Q&A. All right, so thank you for sticking with us through this training session. Now is the time for that Q&A section. And like Lauren mentioned, like if there is a question that pops up after today, or you don't feel comfortable asking it in the Q&A function, feel free to reach out to any of us. And this PowerPoint presentation will be posted on YouTube and on our website as well. And I'm going to send out the slides in addition to some additional resources as well after. So again, you can put in questions in the Q&A function. It should pop up at the bottom of your screen. It says Q&A. If you click on that, you'll be able to input a question. While we wait to see if any questions come up, one thing I want to mention is we actually have 2 virtual drop-in sessions coming up on November 15th and December 4th. So basically, if you register for the competition and you're thinking, oh, you know what, I think I want a little bit more advice from the Writing Communication Center or GSPA, we can kind of guide you a little bit in some tips or give you some advice at those drop-in sessions. Lauren will not be at those sessions, but you can always reach out to Lauren about the copyright questions, because I know that can be a little tricky to navigate. So yes, we'll just wait a little bit to see if there's any Q&A, or if any of the panelists, if there's anything else you want to mention, feel free to do so now as well. And highly appreciate you both coming out for this training session too. All right. Give it a little bit more time if there's any questions that have to come up. To our panelists, are there any very common questions that you happen to get that you can think of at the top of your head that students might ask you? If not, that's okay too.
I think the most common question really is, how do I attribute? And sort of in addition to, you know, the sort of recommendation that you just have a final piece that goes over your references, the things that you used, I'll just say that the Copyright Act doesn't have a specific requirement for how you provide attribution. It just wants you to attribute, to give the author credit. So however you cite in your discipline, or whatever way is easiest for your video, is perfectly fine according to the Copyright Act. You don't have to use a particular style. The Copyright Act doesn't say thou shalt use APA or anything like that.
Perfect, thank you. That's super useful information. I think I've already had one question potentially about copyright in email somewhere that I had forwarded them to you and your office. So I know it can be a little bit tricky.
Yeah, lots of details.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so I'm not seeing any questions come in, but that's okay. If anything comes up, feel free to reach out to us, and I will put the next slide up has the GRADventure email account as well, but we will be posting this as well. If you have, you know, some additional information that you want to re-look at again, or if you want to send this link to someone else that you know in your department who you think might be interested in competing, feel free to do that as well. And I'll send out some additional information, but thank you so much for attending, and thank you to our panelists for coming and giving you some super valuable information about competing in GRADflix and writing communication and copyright in general as well. Even if you don't end up participating in GRADflix, that kind of information can be extremely valuable in other things that you do as well. So thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Ashley.
Thank you.